By the time the letter arrived, I had lived in that house for 18 years. 18 years of waking up in the same bedroom, of learning which floorboard creaked near the hallway and which cabinet door needed to be lifted just right to close properly. 18 years of paying the mortgage without ever missing a month, even during the years when my husband was sick and money felt like something that slipped through my fingers no matter how carefully I held it. So when I saw the envelope from a law firm I didn't recognize, my first feeling wasn't fear. It was confusion. I remember setting my tea down on the kitchen counter and staring out the window at the maple tree in the yard. My husband, Henry, had planted it years ago, before the diagnosis, before hospitals and paperwork became part of our daily vocabulary. The leaves were just starting to turn, and for a moment, I thought about how much he would have liked that. Then I opened the letter. I had to read it 3 times before the words settled into something real. According to the documents enclosed, the house I lived in, the house I had paid for, maintained, protected, did not legally belong to me. It never had. The ownership, it said, was held under the Lewis Family Trust. My hands started to shake. Not dramatically. Just enough to make the paper tremble. Henry had always handled the paperwork. Not because I couldn't, but because he insisted. Whenever I asked questions, he'd smile and say, I've got it covered. You trust me, don't you? And I did. I trusted his sister, Carol, too. She brought meals when Henry was undergoing treatment. She hugged me tightly at the funeral and called me a family in a voice that sounded sincere. And his mother, Elaine, who was never warm, but always proper. She liked to remind me how lucky I was to have been welcomed into their family. Welcomed. I didn't understand how heavy that word was until that letter arrived. Elaine came over 3 days later. She didn't knock. She never had. Thank you in advance. And you, what would you do in this person's place? I would love to hear your opinion, so please share it with me in the comments. I'm always curious about what you all think, and also write me where you heard this story. For more life stories like this, like the video and subscribe to my channel. There are many other stories waiting for you. With heartfelt greetings. Until next time. She walked in like she always did, her eyes moving slowly around the living room, taking inventory. The same look she'd had from the very beginning, as if everything around her needed to justify its existence. I assume you received the letter, as she said calmly, setting her purse down on the table. I didn't want it to come as a shock. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest. I paid the mortgage, I said quietly. Every month. I paid the taxes. The repairs. All of it. She looked at me the way someone looks at a child who doesn't understand how things work. That was your contribution, she replied. Henry wanted you taken care of. But family property stays in the family. There it was. Not anger. Not shouting. Just a clean, careful erasure. That night, I didn't cry. Instead, I did something I had never done in my entire marriage. I opened the filing cabinet Henry always kept locked. He used to say it was just to keep things organized. I had respected that. After he died, I hadn't touched it, not out of fear, but loyalty. A strange habit, clinging to boundaries that no longer mattered. But something inside me shifted that night. Inside the cabinet were years of documents, insurance papers, old bank statements, legal folders labeled in Henry's neat handwriting. And tucked between them, I found something I didn't know existed. A second trust. This one had my name on it. I sat on the floor for a long time, holding those papers, trying to understand why Henry had never told me. Why he had let me believe I was unprotected. Why he had allowed his family to treat me like a guest in my own home. And slowly, painfully, a realization began to form. Henry hadn't trusted his family. He had trusted me to survive. I didn't confront anyone right away. I needed time, not to plan revenge, but to steady myself. I met with a lawyer quietly. I asked questions. I listened more than I spoke. What I learned was simple and devastating. Henry's family had assumed I would panic. That I would leave quietly. That I would fold under pressure the way they believed I always had. They were wrong. When the meeting finally came, the one Elaine insisted on, with Carol sitting beside her, her hands folded as if in prayer, I let them speak first. They talked about tradition. About what Henry would have wanted. About fairness. When it was my turn, I slid the documents across the table. The room went silent. Elaine's face tightened. Carol's eyes darted to the pages, then back to me. The house, it turned out, wasn't the only thing Henry had protected. He had left me far more than they ever knew. The fallout wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices. No slammed doors. Just consequences. The house stayed mine. The trust they thought controlled everything didn't. And the people who once called me family stopped calling altogether. I didn't chase them. Grief had already taught me that not every loss is a tragedy. Some losses are a clearing. It took time to heal. I stayed in the house, but I changed it. I moved furniture. Painted walls. Turned the spare room into something that belonged only to me. Slowly, I learned what it felt like to take up space without apology. People asked me if I was angry. The truth is, I was tired. Tired of being grateful for scraps. Tired of being quiet to keep the peace. Tired of believing that endurance was the same thing as love. What I learned, what took me the longest to understand, was this. I hadn't lost my home. I had reclaimed myself. And that, finally, felt like ownership. After that meeting, I didn't hear from Elaine for weeks. The silence was loud in its own way. For years, she had filled every gap with commentary, what I should cook, how I should speak, what Henry would have preferred. Now there was nothing. No calls. No checking in. No polite threats dressed as concern. Carol texted once. We didn't know about those documents. You blindsided us. I stared at the message for a long time before realizing something important. They weren't angry because I had taken something from them. They were angry because I hadn't stayed predictable. I didn't respond. Instead, I focused on the practical things I had been quietly handling my whole life without recognition. I transferred utilities fully into my name. Updated insurance policies. Locked down accounts I had never realized were accessible to others. Each task was small, but together they formed something solid beneath my feet. For the first time since Henry died, I felt grounded. But the truth, the real truth, didn't come from paperwork. It came from a letter. I found it weeks later, tucked into a book Henry used to read before bed. I must have passed it a dozen times without noticing. It was addressed to me, in his handwriting, the ink slightly faded. I sat on the edge of the bed before opening it, already knowing that whatever was inside would hurt. He wrote about fear. About his family's expectations. About his mother's control, the way love in that house had always come with conditions. He admitted that he had been afraid of confrontation, afraid of disappointing them, afraid of choosing me openly and paying the price for it. But he also wrote this. I didn't protect you loudly. I protected you quietly. I hope that will be enough. I cried then. Not because he was gone, but because I finally understood the shape of the life we had lived together. How much had been said without words? How much had been left unsaid out of fear? The letter didn't excuse everything, but it gave me peace. Elaine tried again after that. She showed up one afternoon, unannounced, standing on the porch with that familiar posture, upright, composed, waiting to be let in. I didn't invite her inside. I think we should talk, she said. I think we've said enough, I replied. Her mouth tightened. You're holding on to bitterness. I shook my head. No. I'm holding on to boundaries. She looked at me then, not as someone she could manage, but as someone she could no longer move. And that was the moment I knew the power had shifted. The months that followed were quieter. Some people drifted away. Friends who had been more connected to Henry's family than to me stopped calling. Invitations disappeared. I let them go without commentary. Others stepped closer. Women I barely knew reached out, sharing their own stories in lowered voices, as if truth itself required discretion. Stories of being sidelined, underestimated, quietly erased. We didn't offer each other advice. We offered recognition. That was enough. I began changing the house slowly. Not to erase the past, but to make room for myself. I painted the bedroom a color Henry would have called impractical. I turned the dining room into a space for writing and quiet mornings. I stopped keeping rooms ready for people who no longer had access to me. And something unexpected happened. The house felt lighter. Not because grief had left, but because I had stopped shrinking inside it. One afternoon, Carol called. Her voice was tight, rehearsed. Mom isn't doing well, she said. This has been very hard on her. I waited. She continued, as she feels like she's lost her son all over again. I thought about Henry's letter. About the years I had swallowed my own needs to keep the peace. I'm sorry she's struggling, I said. But I'm not responsible for her discomfort. Carol exhaled sharply. You've changed. Yes, I said. I have. And for the first time, I didn't soften it. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It came in moments. The first time I laughed without immediately feeling guilty. The first night I slept deeply, without rehearsing conversations in my head. The first morning I realized I wasn't bracing myself for anything. I began to understand that strength didn't come from endurance. It came from discernment. From knowing when something was no longer mine to carry. People sometimes ask me if I regret trusting Henry. I don't. But I do regret trusting silence. I regret believing that keeping the peace was worth the cost of disappearing. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this. You don't need to announce your strength. You don't need to demand recognition. You don't need to prove anything to people committed to misunderstanding you. You just need to stand still long enough for the truth to catch up. And it always does. When I sit in the living room now, sunlight spilling across the floor Henry once paced during phone calls I never questioned, I don't feel bitterness. I feel ownership. Not just of the house. Of my voice. My time. My life. And that kind of ownership can't be transferred, threatened, or taken away. It has to be claimed. There was a morning, not long after everything settled, when I realized I had stopped waiting. I was standing in the kitchen, coffee cooling beside me, sunlight slipping across the counter in that familiar way it always had. Nothing about the room had changed in any dramatic sense. The same cabinets. The same window facing the yard. The same maple tree outside, now taller, fuller, unapologetic in its growth. But something in me had shifted. For the first time since Henry died, maybe for the first time in my life, I wasn't anticipating the next disruption. I wasn't rehearsing explanations or preparing myself to be misunderstood. I was simply there. Breathing. Unguarded. That was when I understood that peace doesn't arrive with noise. It arrives when the noise stops. I didn't become someone new after everything that happened. I became more precise. I learned which conversations deserved my energy and which ones did not. I learned that explanations are often an attempt to negotiate acceptance, and that acceptance is not something you bargain for. I stopped volunteering my time to people who confused access with entitlement. I stopped softening truths to make them easier to swallow. I stopped calling restraint weakness. Instead, I began listening, to myself most of all. There were still days when grief surfaced unexpectedly. A song. A phrase. A familiar habit that belonged to a life I no longer lived. When that happened, I didn't rush to distract myself or assign meaning to it. I let it pass through, the way weather does. Grief, I learned, doesn't demand obedience. It only asks for acknowledgement. The house continued to change, not quickly, but honestly. I kept some things exactly where they were. A chair Henry favored. A book he'd annotated in the margins. Not out of obligation, but because memory doesn't have to be heavy to be respected. Other things I released without ceremony. I gave away items that no longer felt like mine. I rearranged rooms to suit my rhythms, not someone else's expectations. Slowly, the space stopped echoing with who I had been required to be and began reflecting who I actually was. The house became a place of rest. Not performance. People noticed. They said I seemed lighter. Quieter. More myself, as if that version of me had been hiding in plain sight all along. What they didn't see were the small, unremarkable decisions that had led there. Choosing not to respond to messages that drained me. Declining invitations without inventing excuses. Trusting the discomfort of honesty over the exhaustion of pretense. Those choices weren't heroic. They were consistent. And consistency, I discovered, is where real transformation lives. Sometimes I think about Elaine, not with resentment, but with clarity. I understand now that control often wears the costume of concern. That some people confuse authority with love because they've never learned another language. I no longer feel compelled to correct that. Understanding does not require reconciliation. It only requires truth. If someone were to ask me what I gained from all of this, I wouldn't mention the house. I would talk about mornings that feel unhurried. About conversations that don't require translation. About the quiet confidence that comes from knowing I can stand alone without feeling lonely. I would say this. I learned that dignity is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need witnesses. It settles in once you stop abandoning yourself. There are still challenges. Still losses. Still moments of doubt. But they no longer feel like verdicts. They feel like weather. And I trust myself now to move through them. That trust is what remains. And it is enough. I don't know what Henry would think of the life I live now. But I like to believe that somewhere beyond fear and expectation, he would recognize the woman he loved, finally standing in her own truth, no longer waiting to be claimed. As for me, I no longer measure my life by what I endured or what I kept. I measure it by how honestly I live, by how gently I protect my peace, by how little I apologize for existing. When I sit beneath the maple tree in the evenings, watching the light shift and the day loosen its grip, I feel something settle deep inside me. Not victory, not closure, but alignment. And I've learned that alignment is the rarest, most durable form of freedom there is. The strange thing about reclaiming your life is that it doesn't announce itself. There was no morning where I woke up feeling triumphant. No moment where I looked in the mirror and saw someone transformed. What changed instead was quieter, more subtle. I began noticing how often I had been holding my breath, and how rarely I needed to anymore. My days slowed down. Not because I had nothing to do, but because I was no longer rushing to keep up with expectations that weren't mine. I stopped filling silence just to prove I was useful. I stopped explaining decisions that felt obvious to me. And slowly, the tension I'd been carrying for years began to loosen its grip. I didn't realize how deeply fear had shaped my routines until it wasn't driving them anymore. I started walking in the evenings. At first, it was just around the block. Then farther. Past houses I'd passed 100 times without really seeing. I noticed who sat on their porches, who tended their gardens carefully, who let things grow wild. I found comfort in the ordinariness of it all, the quiet proof that life continued whether or not anyone was watching. Sometimes I brought my phone. Most days, I didn't. There was something grounding about moving through the world without being reachable. The house began to feel different as the seasons changed. Winter came softly that year. No drama. Just shorter days, earlier darkness. I lit lamps instead of overhead lights. Cooked meals I liked instead of meals that were efficient. I began leaving dishes until morning if I felt like it, something I had never allowed myself to do before. I realized how much of my discipline had been about proving something. That I was capable, reliable, worth keeping. Now, reliability meant something else. It meant showing up for myself even when no one else was asking me to. I received a call one afternoon from a woman I barely knew. Her name was Lillian. She said she'd gotten my number from Carol, though Carol hadn't mentioned it. Lillian's voice trembled as she spoke. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said. I heard what happened. And I wondered how you knew when it was time to stop trying." The question caught me off guard. I told her the truth. "I didn't know," I said. "I just got tired of disappearing." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then she exhaled, like she'd been holding something heavy. That call stayed with me. Not because of what I said, but because of how many women I realized were quietly asking themselves the same question. I began writing again. Not for anyone else. Not with a goal in mind. Just small reflections. Observations. Sentences that didn't need to lead anywhere. I wrote about grief. About money. About the way love changes shape when it's mixed with obligation. Sometimes I wrote about Elaine, not with anger, but curiosity. How someone could be so convinced that control equaled care. How generations passed down expectations like heirlooms without ever asking who they fit. Writing gave me distance. Distance gave me clarity. One afternoon, months later, I ran into Carol unexpectedly. We were in the grocery store, both reaching for the same loaf of bread. She looked startled to see me, then guarded. Like someone bracing for a conversation she didn't want but felt obligated to endure. We stood there awkwardly for a moment. "You look, well," she said finally. "I am," I replied. She hesitated. Mom still thinks you did this to punish her. I didn't correct her. Some beliefs survive because people need them to. I hope she finds peace, I said instead. Carol nodded, though I could tell she didn't quite understand. Maybe she never would. We parted without hostility. Without reconciliation. And I realized something important as I walked away. Not every relationship needs closure. Some just need distance. The financial part of my life stabilized in ways I hadn't expected. Not because I suddenly had more, but because I was no longer leaking energy in places that returned nothing. I learned how much emotional labor costs. How much time I'd spent managing other people's comfort at my own expense. Once I stopped doing that, everything recalibrated. I began planning, not aggressively, but intentionally. Thinking in terms of sustainability instead of survival. Asking myself not what I could afford, but what I wanted my life to feel like. That question changed everything. There were nights when loneliness crept in. I won't pretend otherwise. But loneliness, I discovered, feels different when it isn't tangled with resentment. When it isn't layered with self-betrayal. It becomes a sensation, not a sentence. I learned how to sit with it. How to let it pass. How not to confuse it with regret. I thought often about the version of myself who would have fought harder to be understood. The woman who believed that if she explained things just right, if she stayed patient long enough, if she sacrificed quietly enough, she would eventually be seen. I felt tenderness for her now. She had done the best she could with the tools she had. But she was no longer steering my life. One evening, as I was sorting through old photographs, I came across one from early in my marriage. Henry and I were standing in front of the house, new paint, younger faces. I was leaning into him slightly, smiling in that careful way I used to. The way you smile when you're still measuring your place. I didn't feel sadness. I felt recognition. That woman had been brave, too, just in a different way. I placed the photo back in the box, not as something to revisit, but as something to respect. Life didn't become simple. But it became honest. And honesty, I was learning, has a rhythm of its own. I didn't hear about Elaine's decline directly. That was the first thing that struck me. For years, news about her had reached me immediately, filtered through obligation, expectation, or subtle demands for involvement. If she was upset, I was supposed to know. If she was disappointed, I was expected to respond. Now, the information came indirectly. Casually. Almost accidentally. A neighbor mentioned seeing her less often at church. Someone else said she'd stepped down from a committee she chaired for years. Carol, apparently, had taken over most of her errands. None of it was presented as a crisis. And that was the point. Elaine had built her authority on presence. On being unavoidable. When people no longer oriented themselves around her reactions, the structure she'd relied on weakened, not dramatically, but steadily. I didn't celebrate that. I noticed it. There's a difference. Carol's situation changed in quieter ways. She used to call frequently, not just me, but everyone. She was the connector, the messenger, the one who translated Elaine's expectations into softer language. She had been skilled at it. Too skilled, maybe. But when I stopped responding the way she expected, when I refused to engage in emotional negotiation, her role began to unravel. People started going directly to Elaine instead of through Carol. And Elaine, without an intermediary, was less persuasive. Carol called me once, late in the evening. I don't know how you did it, as she said suddenly. How you just stepped away. I could hear exhaustion beneath her words. The kind that doesn't come from work, but from carrying responsibility that was never formally assigned. I didn't step away, I said. I stepped into myself. She didn't reply right away. Then she said something I hadn't expected. I don't think Mom ever planned to stop. I knew what she meant. Control, once normalized, rarely has a natural endpoint. I began to see Elaine differently then. Not as a villain, but as a woman who had mistaken dominance for stability. Who had learned early on that being indispensable was the same as being loved. When people stopped needing her approval, she didn't know who to be. That realization didn't soften my boundaries. But it did soften my anger. Months passed. Holidays came and went quietly. I spent them differently, sometimes with friends, sometimes alone, sometimes traveling without explanation. Each choice felt intentional instead of reactive. Carol sent a card one year. It was brief, polite, careful. Elaine's name wasn't mentioned. That omission said more than words ever could. I heard later, again, not directly, that Elaine had tried to reassert herself. She'd attempted to challenge something small at first. A family decision. A minor financial matter. Something that once would have fallen easily under her influence. It didn't work. Not because anyone confronted her, but because no one deferred. There's a moment when authority realizes it has expired. It isn't loud. It's lonely. I thought about Henry then. About the tension he must have lived with his whole life. Loving his family, fearing them, managing them. About the quiet calculations he'd made to protect me without provoking a war he didn't believe he could win. I no longer felt resentment toward him for his silence. I felt compassion for the cost of it. Carol changed, too. Not all at once. But slowly, she stopped calling me for reassurance. Stopped framing conversations as negotiations. Stopped trying to manage how everyone felt. She began speaking more plainly. Once, she admitted, I don't actually know what I want. I've always known what was expected. I recognized that place. It's disorienting. But it's also honest. I didn't step back into their lives. I didn't need to. Distance had already done its work. What surprised me was how little effort it took to maintain my peace once it was established. Boundaries, I learned, are hardest to set, but easiest to keep. I began noticing how often people confuse kindness with compliance. How often women, especially, are taught that being good means being available. Flexible. Forgiving before understanding. I stopped participating in that lesson. Quietly. Consistently. One afternoon, I received a message from Carol. It wasn't long. Mom talks about you sometimes. Not unkindly. Just differently. I didn't ask for clarification. Different was enough. Elaine never apologized. I hadn't expected her to. But she did something else. She stopped trying to rewrite the past. And for someone like her, that was significant. I realized then that consequences don't always arrive as punishment. Sometimes they arrive as reality, unchangeable, unnegotiated, and finally accepted. No audience required. The truth didn't arrive as a confession. It arrived the way most real truths do, through pattern, repetition, and the sudden realization that something you'd accepted as normal never actually was. It started with a conversation that had nothing to do with Elaine. I was sitting with a neighbor one afternoon, a woman named Ruth who had lived on the street longer than I had. We were talking about ordinary things, gardening, weather, the way neighborhoods change when you're not paying attention. At some point, Henry's name came up. Ruth hesitated. Then she said, carefully, he was always so different from the rest of them. I looked at her. Different how? She thought for a moment. Quieter. More watchful. Like he was always anticipating something. The words landed softly, but they stayed with me. Over the next few weeks, similar comments surfaced from different places. A former co-worker of Henry's mentioned how he never talked about his childhood. A distant relative recalled that he'd moved out young, earlier than anyone else in the family. A friend once joked that Henry married freedom, and not just me. At first, I brushed it off. But slowly, a shape began to form. The real shift came during a visit with Henry's aunt, his father's sister. She was older now, her memory less guarded, her speech more unfiltered. We were sitting at her kitchen table, sipping tea, when she said suddenly, Elaine never forgave him. For what? I asked. She looked surprised. For leaving. I waited. He was supposed to stay, she continued. He was the one meant to keep her steady. After his father died, she leaned on him like a second husband. Everyone expected it. The room felt very quiet. He left anyway, she said. Chose a life she couldn't control. She smiled faintly. You. I didn't speak for a long time after that. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I finally understood something that had been hiding in plain sight. Henry hadn't just been managing paperwork. He'd been managing legacy. Everything made more sense after that. Elaine's resentment. Carol's role as mediator. The unspoken expectation that I be grateful, compliant, quietly indebted. The way love in that family always came with terms. Henry had broken a contract he never agreed to, but never fully escaped. And when he died, the pressure shifted to me. I didn't feel angry when I understood this. I felt clarity. The kind that rearranges memory without rewriting it. Henry's silence wasn't just avoidance. It was survival. I began seeing the family dynamics differently, not as personal failures, but as inherited patterns. Elaine had been raised to believe that control was care. Carol had learned that harmony was her responsibility. Henry had learned that peace came at a price. And I, without realizing it, had been absorbed into that system. Until I wasn't. I thought about how often women are asked to inherit emotional labor without consent. How often we're expected to absorb discomfort simply because we're capable of it. How quietly those expectations pass from one generation to the next. Once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. I didn't confront Elaine with this truth. There was no need. Understanding doesn't always require acknowledgement from the source. Sometimes it's enough to stop participating. What surprised me most was how this knowledge changed the way I carried Henry's memory. I stopped seeing him as someone who failed to protect me loudly. I saw him as someone who protected me in the only way he knew how, by giving me an exit. Not just legally, but emotionally. That understanding didn't pull me backward. It moved me forward. I stopped framing my life as something that had been interrupted. I began seeing it as something that had been redirected. And in that redirection, I found something I hadn't expected. Purpose. For a long time, the house had been the boundary of my life. Not physically, I had gone to work, run errands, met obligations, but emotionally. Everything important seemed to circle back to it. Who belonged there? Who had access? Who might try to take something from me? Once that fear dissolved, something unexpected happened. The world felt larger again. It began with small decisions that didn't feel momentous at the time. I accepted an invitation I would have once declined out of habit. I took a weekend trip without checking in with anyone. I enrolled in a short course simply because it interested me, not because it led anywhere obvious. Each choice felt slightly unfamiliar. But not wrong. I started spending more time outside my routines. Long afternoons at libraries. Quiet cafes where no one knew my history. Community lectures I attended alone, sitting near the back, listening without needing to contribute. I realized how long it had been since I'd experienced anonymity without anxiety. There was comfort in being just another person in a room. The house remained important, but it no longer defined me. It became a place I returned to, not something I defended. That distinction changed everything. I met people in this expanded version of my life. Not in dramatic ways. No sweeping introductions. Just conversations that unfolded naturally, without expectation. A woman I sat next to during a workshop invited me to walk with her afterward. We talked about books. About aging. About how life narrows and widens at the same time. Another time, I struck up a conversation with a man while waiting in line at a museum cafe. We talked briefly, pleasantly, then parted without exchanging numbers. And that was enough. Connection didn't need to be collected. It could simply be experienced. I noticed how differently I moved through space now. I didn't rush to fill silence. I didn't over-explain. I didn't apologize for taking up time or air. It wasn't confidence in the traditional sense. It was permission. At home, the house adjusted to this new rhythm. I left windows open more often. Let light move through rooms instead of controlling it. I stopped arranging spaces for hypothetical guests. The house no longer felt like proof of survival. It felt like a base. I traveled more. Nothing extravagant. Nearby cities. Short stays. Places where I could be present without performing familiarity. In one small town, I spent hours wandering without purpose, stopping when something caught my attention, leaving when it didn't. That freedom, simple, unstructured, felt luxurious. I began to understand that independence isn't isolation. It's choice. The ability to engage without obligation. To withdraw without guilt. To remain open without being porous. People asked less about my past. Not because they knew it, but because it no longer led my interactions. I wasn't introducing myself through loss. I was simply there. I still returned to the house each time. But now, when I turned the key and stepped inside, it felt like arrival, not retreat. For a long time, I believed solitude and loneliness were the same thing. They felt similar on the surface: quiet evenings, empty rooms, the absence of someone else's presence. I didn't know how to tell them apart because I'd never experienced one without the other. Now, I was beginning to. The difference revealed itself slowly, through sensation rather than thought. Loneliness had always come with tension. A subtle bracing, as if something were missing and I was responsible for replacing it. Solitude, I discovered, came with release. My shoulders dropped. My breath deepened. I stopped scanning for what wasn't there. The quiet no longer felt accusatory. It felt spacious. There were evenings when I came home and didn't turn on the radio or the television. I let the house remain quiet. At first, It felt almost indulgent, like something I wasn't sure I was allowed to enjoy. I sat with a book, or simply with my thoughts, without trying to redirect them. Nothing dramatic happened. And that was the revelation. I noticed how often loneliness is fueled by self-abandonment. By the way we leave ourselves first, hoping someone else will fill the gap. Solitude, on the other hand, requires presence. You can't be alone well if you're constantly negotiating your worth. I began protecting my time more carefully. Not aggressively. Gently. I let invitations wait. I chose rest over productivity. I learned that declining didn't require justification. And in that protected space, something else emerged. Curiosity. I became curious about my own rhythms. When I worked best. When I needed stillness. How much social interaction felt nourishing rather than draining. These weren't questions I'd ever asked myself before. I had lived according to availability. Now I lived according to alignment. I was invited to speak at a small community gathering one evening, nothing formal, just a group discussion on life transitions. I hesitated at first. The idea of being seen again, even gently, felt unfamiliar. But something told me to go. I didn't prepare a speech. I spoke the way I lived now, plainly, without performance. I talked about how easy it is to confuse endurance with virtue. About how solitude can be an act of repair rather than retreat. Afterward, several people stayed behind. One woman said quietly, I thought being alone meant I had failed. I told her the truth as I understood it. Being alone is not the same as being unloved. The words surprised me with how solid they felt in my mouth. That night, I walked home differently. Not lighter. Steadier. I realized then that loneliness had always been about absence. Solitude was about presence. My presence. There were still moments of longing. I don't want to romanticize this. But longing, when it isn't mixed with fear, becomes information, not suffering. It tells you what matters. Not what's missing. I thought again about Henry. Not with ache. With gratitude for the life we had, and relief that I no longer had to live around unfinished sentences. I could finish my own. I didn't set out to become anyone's example. That was important to me. For most of my life, I had lived under other people's expectations, roles assigned without discussion, responsibilities framed as virtue. I wasn't interested in trading one set of projections for another. And yet, something shifted. People began finding me. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just small moments that accumulated until I couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. It started with conversations that lingered. Someone would ask a question after a meeting. A neighbor would sit a little longer on my porch than necessary. A woman I barely knew would lower her voice and say, Can I ask you something personal? They weren't asking for advice. They were asking for permission. Permission to stop explaining. Permission to rest. Permission to choose themselves without turning it into a moral debate. I recognized that hunger immediately. I'd lived inside it for years. I was careful. I didn't tell people what to do. I didn't frame my life as a blueprint. I spoke only from my own experience, and only when asked. I didn't leave because I was strong, I'd say. I left because I was exhausted from pretending I wasn't hurting. That honesty seemed to land deeper than confidence ever had. One afternoon, a woman named Marisol came to see me. She'd been referred by someone else, though I hadn't asked to be referred. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, hands folded tightly, eyes darting like she was afraid of saying the wrong thing. "I don't know how to stop," she said suddenly. "Everyone depends on me. If I pull back, everything falls apart." I didn't answer right away. Then I said, as sometimes things fall apart because they were never meant to be held together by one person. She cried, not loudly, but thoroughly. I didn't rush her. I knew better than to interrupt that kind of release. After that, I began hosting small gatherings. Nothing formal. No titles. No agendas. Just conversation. We talked about caregiving, money, aging parents, marriages that quietly hollowed out. About the guilt that shows up when women imagine a life that belongs to them. I didn't lead. I listened. And in listening, something communal formed, without consuming me. I was mindful of my boundaries. I went home alone. I rested. I kept my solitude intact. Healing doesn't mean availability. It means discernment. What surprised me most was how these conversations reflected my own journey back to me. Each story carried a familiar echo, different details, same emotional architecture. The pressure to absorb, to smooth, to endure. Seeing it from the outside sharpened my understanding. What I'd survived wasn't unusual. It was systemic. I began to feel less like an exception and more like a point on a larger map. That realization didn't diminish my experience. It contextualized it. There were moments when I felt the pull to do more. To organize. To formalize. To step into a role with clearer edges. I resisted that instinct. Not everything meaningful needs a structure. Some things grow best when left organic. I still had quiet evenings. Still walked alone. Still returned to the house as a place of restoration, not obligation. But now, my life extended beyond me in a way that didn't drain. It circulated. I thought about Elaine again, not with judgment, but with distance. She had built a world that required constant reinforcement. I was building one that held even when I stepped away. At first, I almost deleted it. The sender was a lawyer I didn't recognize, representing a distant relative of Henry's. Nothing urgent, just a polite inquiry. There had been a minor adjustment to a trust, a piece of property Henry had quietly left to someone else. Would I confirm the details? I stared at the screen for a long time. It wasn't a threat. Not really. But it carried that same familiar weight, the silent expectation that I would respond. That I would care enough to step into a performance I no longer recognized. I didn't respond immediately. I drank my coffee and let the house wake around me. Sunlight spilled across the kitchen counters, warm and steady. The email felt small compared to the life I was building. But I noticed something new. I no longer flinched. When I finally replied, I did it calmly. Precisely. Professionally. Not because I wanted to assert myself, but because I wanted clarity. I copied every relevant document, every statement, every ledger that proved the arrangements had been made long before any of this resurfaced. I answered questions with facts, not emotion. And for the first time, I felt something entirely different, satisfaction without drama. A few weeks later, the lawyer called. I must say, he said, a little awkwardly, you've handled this exceptionally. Most people would have panicked or resisted. I smiled, even though he couldn't see me. I've learned the cost of panicking, I said. And I've learned the cost of resistance that isn't strategic. He chuckled. I suppose that's one way to put it. It made me reflect on how often money and property had been used as instruments of tension in my life. Elaine, Carol, Henry, they all understood the unspoken power of ownership. How it could shape behavior, bend decisions, demand attention. I had inherited none of that instinct, not naturally. I had only learned it from necessity. And now, faced with this quiet challenge, I realized I was no longer reacting. I was applying it deliberately. The relative involved never caused trouble. They had expectations, yes, but they respected facts. And so, a potential crisis passed without incident. No confrontation. No one left wondering who had won. The difference wasn't in the outcome, it was in me. I thought of Henry again. He had spent so much of his life mediating between family, expectation, and obligation. I understood now that he had done it silently, at his own cost, and that I had been spared the full weight of it only because I'd chosen to walk my own path. That understanding didn't absolve the past, but it reframed it. Later, I noticed how this quiet handling of money and property rippled outward. People in my life began trusting me differently, not because I asserted authority, but because I operated with steadiness. They saw that I wasn't reactive, that I didn't allow fear or anger to dictate my choices. Some even came to me for advice, not for control, but to learn composure. And it struck me, power doesn't need to be performative. It can exist simply through consistency. That evening, I walked through the condo slowly. Rooms I had once organized for appearances were now arranged for life. Chairs where people liked to sit. Books where I wanted them. Paintings that reflected moments of meaning. I paused in the study, the room Henry had once called the heart of the house. I traced my fingers over the desk, remembering the weight of the years I'd spent navigating obligations and expectations. Now it felt light. Unburdened. Mine. And yet, I didn't rush to fill it with business. There was a lesson in the pores. Wealth, property, even family connections. None of it defines you if you've claimed your autonomy first. I knew, in the quietest part of myself, that this lesson would echo for years. Not loudly. Not as proof. But as a rhythm, the rhythm of choosing self over expectation, clarity over drama, steadiness over spectacle. I used to notice the rhythms of my past in everything I did. A sudden question from Elaine or Carol. A pointed comment from a relative. Even a familiar tone in Henry's old friends. They used to unsettle me, not with violence, but with expectation. I would rehearse answers, brace for disappointment, weigh the invisible ledger of obligation. Now, the same patterns surfaced in small ways, and I noticed them differently. A distant cousin once brought up a long-forgotten family feud. In the past, I would have felt the walls closing, scrambling to mediate, to appease, to prevent fallout. I listened instead. I acknowledged the feelings without absorbing them. I offered no solution. Just presence. And the conversation moved on, unaltered by my choices. The shift was subtle, but profound. I realized I had been carrying years of inherited tension like a second skin, tight, restrictive, and invisible. And now, for the first time, it no longer fit. One afternoon, Carol called again. "I don't know how you do it," as she said, quietly. I hear about situations, Elaine's remarks, disputes over property, and you don't flinch. You don't react. You just, or exist. I paused. I exist because I've stopped trying to control what isn't mine. There was a long silence on the line. Then she said, softly, "I think I understand now." I could hear the weight of revelation in her voice, the subtle surrender that comes not from loss, but from clarity. Even Elaine's presence became less intimidating over time. Not absent. Not transformed magically. Just, or smaller in scope. Her attempts at influence no longer carried the same power, not because I resisted her, but because I no longer needed her validation. The old lessons of fear and compliance, the ones handed down from generation to generation, lost their grip. They became a backdrop, not a blueprint. I noticed this most in quiet, ordinary moments. A neighbor asking for advice about a minor family dispute. I could offer perspective without emotional taxation. A friend navigating a divorce. I could listen without taking on their burden as if it were mine. Even in moments of personal temptation, old triggers, familiar frustrations, I paused. I observed. I responded with intention, not instinct. It felt like walking through a room I had once known only as a maze. The doors were still there. The walls still existed. But I no longer needed to navigate them with fear. I moved freely, deliberately, noticing what mattered and letting the rest recede. And the beauty of it was that nothing dramatic happened. No vindication. No explosive confrontation. No sweeping announcements of change. Just steady, persistent presence. Just life unfolding on its own terms. I began to see that this was the real victory. Not proving anyone wrong. Not winning property or asserting authority. But existing fully, calmly, and without apology. I even began mentoring quietly, as if by accident. Women would come to me with questions about boundaries, about autonomy, about self-respect. I didn't instruct. I reflected. I listened. I helped them see what they already knew but had been taught to doubt. And watching them step into their own agency reminded me again that the old patterns, Elaine's influence, Carol's mediation, even Henry's quiet sacrifices, no longer determined my path. I walked home one evening after one such conversation, the city quieting around me. I noticed the weight in my chest was gone, the tension I didn't realize I'd carried for decades. And in its place was something expansive. A calm authority. A steady rhythm. A certainty that my choices mattered because I made them, not because someone else demanded it. It took years for me to see it clearly, but now I can feel it every morning. The house, the city, the quiet streets I walk along, they aren't constraints. They are mirrors. They reflect the life I've claimed. I wake with intention. I drink my coffee slowly, letting the sun touch the counter. I don't plan my happiness around someone else's approval. I choose it first, every day, in small but deliberate ways. Mentoring others continues to come naturally. Women who have carried too much, too many expectations, too many inheritances of obligation, they find me. And I listen. Not with judgment, not with instruction, but with the presence I once longed to find for myself. I see them pause, recognize their own strength, and leave the conversation with something that feels like ownership. Not over my life, but over theirs. It's quiet work, but it matters. Even romance, when it arrives, does so gently. Not dramatic, not urgent. Just someone who sees me without trying to define me, who listens without interruption, who respects boundaries I didn't even know I could enforce. It's nothing like the entanglements I endured before. It's nothing like the expectations I once carried for Henry, Elaine, or Carol. It's life lived on its own terms. Sometimes, I look back and remember that silver anniversary. The way Richard thought he could script my reaction. The way Elaine and Carol had shaped my world with subtle insistence. The quiet inheritance of control and expectation that hung over me like a shadow. I don't feel bitterness. I feel clarity. I survived. I observed. I acted. And then I let go. The condo, the city, the life I have now, they are all testaments not to what I endured, but to what I chose. I no longer define myself by what I've been given or taken. I define myself by what I cultivate. I light a candle on the balcony sometimes, not to mourn or celebrate, but to acknowledge. Acknowledgement of the past. A recognition of the choices that shaped me. A quiet promise to myself that I will continue to live with clarity, integrity, and presence, no matter what the world brings. Some mornings I walk along the river. The city stretches around me, lights glimmering on the water. I take it in slowly, letting it wash over me. The past whispers, but I don't answer it. I keep moving forward. The lessons are not dramatic, they are persistent. Not explosive, they are steady. Not visible, they are deeply, internally transformative. I am no longer reacting. I am living. Fully. Deliberately. Calmly. I have learned that dignity is not given. It is chosen. Freedom is not granted. It is claimed. And the life that matters most is not one built to satisfy others, it is one built to honor the truth I carry within me. And so, I continue. Walking through the city, standing quietly in my studio, mentoring, laughing, observing, choosing. No endings. No finales. Just the ongoing practice of being fully, unmistakably, myself. And that, I know now, is a life worth living.